Speak to Firas Maksad. He's an adjunct professor at George Washington University, joining us now from Washington, D.C. Good to have you with us on the News Hour. So when you look at the latest developments and the U.S. suspending its participation in bilateral channels with Russia when it comes to Syria, what is your take on that? Because there seems to be a bit of a blame game going on. The Obama administration saying they don't want to talk because of Russia's role in Aleppo, and the Russians saying that the U.S. is not living up to its side of the agreement, particularly when it comes to not persuading moderate opposition fighters to disassociate themselves from more radical elements. Your take?
Thank you, Darine. There's definitely a tit for tat or a blame game that's going on here, but the reality is that on the ground, the military power as it is, the Syrian regime, along with the Russians and pretty much a lot of the Iranian proxies, including Hezbollah, are poised to attack Aleppo after having laid siege to the city. They have the military advantage. They stand to lose from a ceasefire rather than the rebels who stand to gain from a ceasefire. So the facts on the ground as we know them is that Russia, together with its allies in Syria, don't have much of an interest in a ceasefire right now. And President Assad keeps hammering the point that he will retake Aleppo. This has been their strategy for months now, and it should come as no surprise to anybody.
But people are surprised that the U.S. has decided to suspend talks and relations, particularly at this point. So in your opinion, what is the U.S. going to do next? Does it have a strategy?
Unfortunately, the U.S. does not have a strategy. I would argue that the U.S. has not had a strategy all along in Syria. The American focus here is really much more on containing and eventually defeating ISIS, whether along the Euphrates Valley, whether it's in Syria or in Iraq. Really, there isn't much attention being paid as to what happens to Assad and then how to contain that conflict. And as we wind down this administration in the last 2 to 3 months of the Obama White House, the focus has really went elsewhere in Washington.
And speaking of the White House and, in fact, the upcoming presidential election, what happens next? I mean, does this put pressure on Obama at all to find a solution when it comes to Syria before his term winds down?
It's actually jarring. It's quite to the contrary. Those who follow the U.S. presidential elections know that Syria has not figured at all in the debates. Neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump have brought Syria up. And even more surprising that the Republican candidate, usually to the right of a Democratic president, is calling for cooperation with Russia and possibly even cooperation with the Syrian regime in trying to roll back and defeat ISIS. So not much pressure at all from the domestic context of American politics, an American electorate that has been fatigued by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past decade.
And when you look at the suspension at this point of the bilateral relations between Russia and the U.S., it's important to note that what the State Department is saying is that this move by the U.S. Does mark the end of U.S.-Russia engagement on Syria, but they're saying doesn't necessarily affect efforts involving both countries through larger groups of countries, such as the UN, to find a solution. Is there any hope that the UN can find a solution at this point?
Well, it's a good play and a good outcome for Moscow. They are, as the report mentioned right now, heading the Security Council, so they do have leverage at the Security Council too. That makes me less hopeful that resolutions tabled by France and Britain and others will actually make it through in any meaningful way. I think the Russians will, A, veto, or B, trying to dilute the text as much as possible. So I really don't see that there is going to be much forward movement in terms of diplomacy for Syria in the near future. But then, as a Prussian general once said, that war is diplomacy by other means, and I do think that the guns are going to speak most loudly in the coming weeks and months ahead, unfortunately.
All right. Firas Maksad, we thank you very much for joining us on the Al Jazeera News Hour. Plenty more.